Welcome to Fun and Games Side Quests. Every episode is a different host sharing a video game they love and why they love it.
Hello, my name is Justin Grandfield. I'm a technical support analyst and soon-to-be freelance writer, a researcher, and a general video game preservation enthusiast. I'm here to talk to you about Parasite Eve, one of my favorite games of all time. So to kind of talk about this game, I have to kind of tell you about my history with this game. This game was a gift for my 15th birthday from my dad. And I initially saw this game in a magazine, and I believe it's EGM, and I fell in love with this game. I don't really know why. I think it was more like the kind of more realistic style of graphics. Like, I initially bought the magazine for Blue Stinger, and that game ended up being a dud. But anyway, I asked my dad for this game for my 15th birthday, along with a PlayStation, because I didn't own one at the time. And lo and behold, he got it for me, and I just fell in love with this game. Loved it from minute one of this game to the ending credits and beyond. It's one of the few games I've played more than 15 times. So what do I like about this game? What I like about it is that it's this interesting hybridization of a role-playing game that you just don't really see much of, like in the 90s. You see it more now, but you didn't see it as much back then. And this is also the time of Square Enix's golden age of weird experimental titles, like Air Guides and Einhander, Vagrant Story, things like that. And interesting story, this game's combat system ended up being kind of a test for Vagrant Story. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, so what do I like about this game? So at the time when I got this game, I was kind of in this period of transitioning from playing mostly platformers like Sonic and Mario to kind of starting to get into role-playing games like Final Fantasy. And in fact, this kind of fueled my love for classic Square Enix games, because this game came with the demo disc that included Xenogears, another game I've played so many times I can't count anymore. But this game was interesting because it had that unique combat system that was kind of this weird hybridization of survival horror and RPG. And it created this space where you were in combat, but you could move around. And you'd had turns, and you'd have to wait until your turn to be able to act, but you could still move around avoiding enemy attacks and stuff like that. And that was pretty cool. I hadn't seen a game like that at the time. I was just used to being in platformers and just being able to move out of the way or jump or whatever, and just avoiding enemy attacks was kind of intuitive to me. I wasn't used to turn-based RPGs where you just are assumed to just get hit all the time. But what this did is you could move around, shoot, use turns to heal up or use items, etc. And that was a pretty cool concept. Another thing that really drew me in is the premise of the story, which was that mitochondria had gone rogue as a result of them breaking off from the symbiosis with the nucleus in the human cells. And that was an interesting story because it was very sci-fi and very deep, and I was really into kind of science at the time. I actually wanted to be a chemist when I was a lot younger. That didn't end up happening, of course, but hey. But it was a really cool and interesting story. It took that concept and really kind of sold it to me. It also made sure I knew what mitochondria was, and it will tell you several times. There's even a full little series of quizzes you can find in one area that'll quiz you on mitochondria. And it's really interesting. But it's a game that really kind of isn't afraid to wear its nerdy side on its sleeve. You have the character of Kunihiko Maeda, who is the link to the game's predecessor, which was a novel written in Japan. And he's always mentioning the incident that happened in Japan, which is the precursor for events that happened in Parasite Eve. Anyway, so another good thing about this game is the music. The music is just phenomenal. Yasunori Mitsuda did the music and just nailed it. All the music has this weird kind of combination of techno and operatic music, and it works so well for this game. And it creates this leitmotif between old and new throughout the whole game. You have this old story being made into a new video game. And there's also some really good tracks like Memory and the battle themes. All of them are just fantastic, but particularly Memory is interesting because it builds with the story. And there's also the battle themes with Eve that do that too, which are really interesting. Memory kind of gives you this first example with just very basic piano notes during the first couple of scenes in which it's used. There's a lot of mystery and there's a lot that's not known. So it's just that one bit of piano music. The second one adds a few more instruments and it becomes more interesting. Become more engrossed in that one because there's more instruments coming in. The third one, everything comes in for that song. And it's at a time where Aya has really kind of put all the pieces together. Everything's understood, everything's known, and all the pieces have finally come together to understand why things have been happening, the links to the incident in Japan, how it affects Aya, and what she's got to do to end this conflict. We also have the interesting dynamic between Aya, Daniel, and Maeda. Daniel is the kind of the father figure for Aya. She's a more senior cop in the station than she is. And he helps to kind of guide her along, give her advice when she needs it, and just kind of pep talk her when she needs it. Because there's a point where she is just genuinely afraid of herself because of these new powers she's developed as a result of her contact with Eve. She's developed the ability to heal herself, do damage, shield herself, but she doesn't know what it's going to evolve into. And she's afraid of becoming like Eve. And that's where Daniel comes in and he states that he knows that Aya will never become like Eve because Aya has too much confidence in herself to let herself be overcome by her own mitochondria like Eve was. And that's really great because it shows that really emotional bond between Aya and Daniel. And it's a really needed kind of nice touch because it gives you some investment in the story, as well as investment in Daniel, as well as Maeda, who has interactions with both Daniel and Aya as well throughout the story. Throughout the story, Maeda is more nervous and jumpy, but he's willing to throw himself into the line of fire to be able to discover what's going on. He knows that only Aya can really proceed forward, but he will do what he can to assist her in that endeavor. He even tries to, give her special trinkets throughout the story, and even develops the weapon that helps to end Eve's reign of terror. And it's just a great dynamic and interplay between the three characters. And it's good that this cast is kept to a small number of people because it helps really kind of ground the story. Because it is a very small story and it doesn't need a lot of characters gunking up the works. So, moving on from there, let's talk about the story itself. The story, like I said, is the liberation of mitochondria that happens as a result of Eve. But what brings Eve into this? There's a lot of different factors for the villain side of this story. There's Eve herself, the actress Melissa Pierce's body, who has been taken over by Eve, as well as Dr. Hans Klomp, who acts as kind of the secondary antagonist. Though you don't really fight him, he is just more of that evil character kind of setting things in motion. Kind of like in Final Fantasy VII, where Sephiroth is kind of created by a mad scientist. And so he kind of serves as that secondary antagonist throughout the story. He's only really shows up a few times, so he's not really used to full effect, I believe, but I think he's used well enough. Because the focus is supposed to be on Eve herself. Eve herself is a really interesting character because she's just this horrific monstrosity. She's mutating animals, reviving dinosaurs to fight on her behalf, and even just mutating animals to like a great degree, or even merging people with animals. And it's a really kind of gross but like engaging story. Like Eve really kind of sticks it to us at times. Like she even attacks the police station that Aya is stationed out of to kind of slow her down and take down her allies. And so we also kind of see this dynamic of Eve and Aya building up where it's going to come to a head. And it finally does come to kind of an explosive head on the fifth day of the game, where Aya and Eve have their final battle. And it's indicative of the struggle between apex predators. Aya herself ends up becoming this apex predator as a result of her time throughout this game, learning and growing and becoming more powerful. Her parasite energy powers evolving. And another interesting aspect, kind of along that same lines of growth, is that one of the game's mechanics revolves around the growth of the weapons and armor. You can retool weapons and armor into more stronger versions of themselves by ripping stats or parameters or special abilities off of one piece of equipment and sticking onto another, making that weapon or piece of armor stronger. You can keep doing this until you have like the ultimate weapon or piece of armor. It's a great way to do this alongside the bonus point system, where you get bonus points for defeating enemies without taking damage. You get those points at level up, but you can spend those on things like stat increases or AT recharge or item and inventory capacity. But it's a really interesting way of doing this because it makes the weapons and armor grow along with Aya. So you have a real scale of the sense of power you had at the beginning of the game and where you are at the end of the game. And speaking of the end of the game has a post-credits game called the EX mode, which introduces new enemies and a 77 floor dungeon set in the Chrysler building. It's really difficult, it's really hard, and you need the weapon and armor that you take with you from the initial playthrough to really be able to go through this and do well. Because if you don't, you're going to be vastly underpowered and just splattered within the first enemy encountered. Because when you enter the EX mode, you start right back from level 1. It's really encouraged to kind of go through the game and build up your strength and powers again, though it's not totally necessary. You still have to go through the first day, so you'll get some levels there and some items. But each 10th floor you get to, you fight a super boss, which can be an evolved form of another boss enemy or another enemy type you encountered earlier in the game, or there are a couple of unique super bosses in there, namely the roach and the bees, which are very, very challenging fights and will test your knowledge of the game's mechanics quite a bit. And on the top floor, there is a super boss who I will not spoil because it is very story intensive, but it is a very cathartic fight, and it will really kind of give you a sense of the conflict within Aya herself throughout this entire story, as well as kind of understanding Aya's past. But one of the weirdest things about the Chrysler building that every non-10th floor and floors 71 through 77 are randomized. The maps are completely randomized. So you don't know where you're going from game to game. The maps will change every time. So it is imperative that you have a strategy guide sometimes, or just learn how to map the dungeon from floor to floor. Because there's always like a closet where you can find an item, and that's important because there's a lot of items you can only find there, and they're very powerful. But it's interesting because it also gives you an alternate ending to the main story. The main ending is interesting itself, but the alternate story kind of gives you a different kind of view of things. And for the sequel, Parasite Eve 2, it's never really divulged which ending is canon because they both had this ending feeling to them, if you know what I mean. But it's vague enough that like we don't know exactly which game is the actual canon ending. I assume the first ending is canon, but like it doesn't make sense at times, as well as the second ending. So it's weird to see how this game ends and where it leads to in the sequel. But anyway, the music is just another aspect I have to harp on again. The music really, really, really sells this game because it really kind of brings in this mood. There's a lot of great ambient music throughout the game, and the battle music is phenomenal. Like Awake Within You and Plosive Attack are both great tracks, and they really will pump you up. As I said earlier, Memory is a great series of tracks. The final fight between Aya and Eve, Femme Fatale, is great. Like, it's just a upscaling of the Eve fight, but it adds a lot more kind of drama in the notes, and it really just kind of helps improve the mood of the fight. Lastly, I'd like to just quickly address Parasite Eve 2, because it's an interesting game in itself, because it goes more the Resident Evil side of things. Whereas this game kind of has this weird hybridization. It's interesting to see why they changed things, because they saw Resident Evil was doing great and kind of wanted to follow that formula and see where they went with it. And it's a really interesting game in and of itself, but I won't go too far into it because it's just a phenomenal game you could replay over and over and over again, because there's like 4 different game modes and just a list of special rewards you can get. Like there's 12 different, I think it's 12. Yeah, it's like 12 to 14 different reward levels. Anyway, I want to say if you've never played Parasite Eve in your life, you owe it to yourself to try it. If you have an older PSN account, like on PS3 or Vita, you can buy it there. It's a great game, and you should definitely try it, because it is just one of the best games you'll ever play. And it's a very interesting game because of its hybrid kind of gameplay between survival horror and RPG. It has a great soundtrack. It has a great interplay between the game's main cast. The cast is kept small enough to where the story is much more focused on that group of characters. And it's interesting enough where the plot is unique enough where we've never seen this kind of story before. It's a very interesting aspect to take from I would say, obscure to us novel from Japan, and turning that into a very interesting and fun video game here in the West and in Japan. And it's just interesting that they chose the setting of New York. And I think that's kind of why I got drawn into it, because it's a real location. And so I became interested in playing that. So I will conclude by saying, give yourself a chance to play Parasite Eve, and you will find it's a great game you can keep playing over and over again. And I think it's one of the best PlayStation games of all time. I'm Justin Grandfield, and this has been Side Quests. Happy gaming, everyone.
So, I have a question. Have you ever wanted to get into comics, but you just didn't know where to start? Well, welcome to Comics Quest. I'm JD Martin, and every week I sit down with a guest to talk a comic that I think anybody can pick up and start their comics reading journey. We take a look at psychedelic sci-fi, fantastical action, heart-wrenching love stories, and of course, superheroes. So check us out at certainpov.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
CPOV.
certainpov.com.